Good afternoon. My name is Adrian O'Dell and I'm with the Norfolk Polish Heritage Group, and I'm in Watton in Norfolk today to talk to somebody who has got a very important story to tell about their Polish roots and their Polish family. And I'd like to ask you first of all, good afternoon, to introduce yourself and tell me your name and perhaps where and when you were born.
Hello, I'm Rysia Bane. I was born in what was then Persia, which is now Iran, in November 1942.
And what was your name at birth, your family name?
My family name was Wiszniewska, because there's a difference between Wiszniewska and Wiszniewska.
Yes, well, Poles would understand that,
yes,
but
quite, yes.
The British wouldn't make that change of understanding. So, would you tell me first of all about why you're in Norfolk and how long have you been in Norfolk?
I got married in 1977 and my husband and I decided we wanted to obviously buy our own property, and we looked around. He was from Surrey or Kent, somewhere around there, and I was from the Midlands. We wanted somewhere perhaps in the middle, I guess, and we looked around and we found that Norfolk was very nice, and that's why we settled here. We found a place in near Swaffham, Spall, and we bought a place there.
And although you're a Norfolk woman now, I understand that you still have very strong connections with Polish. You learned to speak Polish as a child.
Yes, we obviously when we came, because we were in Africa for some time until the war ended, and then we came here to England in 1949, 50, something like that. None of us could speak English, so when I went to school, I couldn't speak any English at all. And that the school wasn't very far where we lived, and at lunchtime I go home and Mum said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "Well, I can't understand a word they're saying, so I've come home." But within the year, when my sisters went, they could speak English.
And this was a Polish school?
No, it was an English school. It was an English school, so we only spoke in Polish. And then obviously going to an English school, I was the only foreigner there, this school, and of course I didn't understand a word. But within a year of my sisters going, they could speak English.
So tell me about your father. What was his name, and when and where was he born?
So my father's name was Jan Wiszniewski. He was born in Warsaw. His birth certificate, well, we haven't got a birth certificate. He always maintained that he was born in 1897, but Mum told us that was because he wanted to go into the army, and they would only take them when they were 17 years old. So he actually said he was born in 1897, whereas in fact he was born in 1900.
And of course, it wasn't really Poland at that time, it was partitioned, wasn't it?
That's correct, yes. And of course he was in Warsaw, and Warsaw at the time was under Russian control. And so to become an officer, which is what he wanted to do, he had to go to Russia, to the academy of whatever they called it then at the time. But where, I don't know.
And I understand he had some adventures. He tried to escape.
Well, the Russian Revolution broke out, didn't it, in 1917, 18, something like that, when they were in Russia. So obviously he and his fellow Polish officers who were there didn't want to stay and fight the Russians, so they needed to escape. And it would be a wonderful story to actually know what happened, but I do know that they were trying to make their escape to the port of Archangels, and from there they could take a ship to France, which apparently they did. Now, when Dad got hit by a dum-dum bullet, I'm not sure, but he did. He got hit in the leg, and of course the leg was shattered, and they wanted to amputate. And he said no. If they did, he had a pistol and he would kill himself and the doctor as well.
Oh, gosh.
So there was a young doctor. Now whereabouts I don't know, but this is what Mum told us. There was a doctor who did save his leg. They did get out of Russia and they did go to Paris. They ended up in Paris.
And what happened after that?
And then, of course, General Haller was trying to get an army together at that time because the independence came. Poland became independent, but the Russians didn't want to leave. So you had that Russian-Soviet war, and General Haller was trying to get an army together to Poland, and I believe they did, about 25,000 men, something like that. They travelled to Poland then, and I know that reading a book, the Germans wouldn't allow them to take weapons with them. They had to have them in one of these wagons, sealed, so that they couldn't have the weapons with them when they travelled. And they obviously travelled to Poland, and then there was a war there, wasn't there, in 1921 or something like that. And then after the war, because Poland did get its independence,
Indeed.
Dad went into banking and was a banker until 1939, when he was called up again as an officer into the army, the Polish army.
The start of World War II.
At the start of World War II, yes.
And he was married by that time.
They married. My mum and Dad married in the May of 1939.
And what was her name?
Mum's name was Bizon, Bizon.
And her first name?
And her first name was Zofia.
And what happened then at the outbreak of the war?
So we don't know for sure when, but they were not together in September 1939. We got photographs of Mom being somewhere in a place called Grodno in Poland because it was in August and war broke out in September. So they were not together when war broke out. Mum obviously was somewhere near the eastern border when war broke out, because was it 2 weeks after the war broke out, 3 weeks after the war broke out, the Russians then they'd already become allies to the Germans, but they crossed the border then, and they were taking Polish people as forced labour out of Poland. And Mum was one of those first people who was taken out.
And where did they take her to?
And she was very fortunate that she didn't have to go to any of like Siberia and any of these horrible camps. She was taken to Georgia, over the Caucasus Mountains, where they desperately needed people to work in all these, I suppose it was more or less, Georgia was the food centre of Russia because they grew everything there. And so she was taken to Georgia with, I think, a friend of hers there. The two of them went together. But
it was more than just working there. It was forced labour.
Oh, it was forced labour, that's right. However, the difference, I think, was that the Georgians themselves hated the Russians. So any help they could give Polish people, they got.
And so, where was your father?
Well, that we don't know what happened. He was obviously in the army by then. They were fighting, and he was a reservist. And then when Warsaw fell, and then the Russians crossed over the border, they were fighting the Germans from the front, and the Russians were stabbing them in the back. He was captured, and I think that was the end of 1939. He was captured by the Russians. Where, we don't know, but I suspect it was somewhere near Lvov. And then he was taken for forced labour. And somehow, miraculously, he ended up in Georgia as well. Not in the same area, but in Georgia also.
That's remarkable, isn't
Absolutely remarkable, yes. Now the theory is, we've been trying to theorise, and we think that when the army was told to disband, the Polish army, when they knew they were not going to win, I think the order came out that they were to try and get to the Romanian border. But I think Dad was trying to get back to where he knew Mum was.
Had he had any contact or any knowledge where she was?
Well, he must have had some knowledge where she was. When she left, he must have had some knowledge, and I suspect, or we do suspect, that he tried to get back to wherever she was staying, hoping that she would still be there, which of course she wasn't. She was already gone. But he was captured as well and ended up in Georgia also, and I think that's a miracle.
And did they then meet at all?
So this was it. This would have been the beginning of end of 1939, beginning of 1940, and there we don't know exactly when they met up, and I suspect it was somewhere at the end of 1940. Dad was obviously there almost a year, as was Mum, in different labour camps. But in these particular labour camps, and that's why I say it was slightly better than, for instance, in Siberia and all these other camps that there was the forced labour taken out, that they actually paid them for doing the work. Not a lot, it was pittance, but they did get paid. You couldn't buy anything because there wasn't anything there to buy. But they were able to have a pass to leave the camp and go into the nearest town, and the nearest town from where Mum was Batumi. So periodically she and her other friends, they would actually save whatever they got, and then they would go off to Batumi and go and have a slap-up meal.
Do some shopping there. And
well, there wasn't much to buy, she said. Even in Batumi there wasn't a lot to buy. So what they did, they would rather spend the money on a slap-up meal and go to a hotel, especially foreign hotels still there, because Batumi was quite an important town in Russia because it was something to do with oil.
Yeah.
So there was a lot of foreign visitors coming there. So they had to the hotels had to be on a par, and so they would go and have a slap-up meal in one of these hotels. And she does tell the story that they went one day, and in those days, as you've got it to hear now in the posh hotels, there's always a pianist playing, isn't there? And there was always a pianist playing there, so they went and they paid the pianist to play, and they asked him to play the Polish national anthem.
But we still haven't got closer to your father. How did they meet?
We don't actually know where Dad was, but Mum eventually, because of the lack of food or fruit and vegetables, actually got scurvy and was very, very seriously ill. And the doctor said the only way you can get out of this is by eating as much fruit and vegetables as you can. And her friends, I mean, that's quite hilarious what they used to try and do to get her to have these vegetables. But she was in a very weakened state, so her friend went off to Batumi, and she's walking down the street there, and who does she bump into but my dad?
Really?
Yes.
And she'd clearly known him.
Oh yeah, because they were
friends
together.
before.
They were friends before. That's right. Yes.
So what happened next?
So then, obviously, she told Dad everything, and he then said, "Right, okay," and off they went back to this labour camp. By this time, Mum was actually living with there were 3 friends in total, and one of the friends married a Georgian doctor. And so by this time, Mum, because she was in such a weakened state, she was actually living with them. And Dan went to the house with this other friend, and Mum tells the story that there's a knock on her bedroom door, and the doctor comes in and says, "I have a visitor for you." and in walks Dad.
Wonderful.
I know. It was wonderful, wasn't it? Yeah.
So they clearly had a very happy reunion then.
Absolutely, yes. Now Dad was a bookkeeper, a banker bookkeeper, and he also, because he had been to Russia, he'd finished military school in Russia, he knew the psychology of the Russians, he could speak fluent Russian, and he knew they were all corrupt. And so when the first labour camp where he was, he actually said, I'll do your books for you and I'll make sure everything is covered. And so he went to the commander of this labour camp and offered his services, and they were accepted willingly.
This is where your mother was?
Yes.
So he switched?
And he said, you can sort it all out between the two labour camps. He said, but I'm staying here and I'll do your books for you. He willingly, they said yes straight away.
He obviously had an air of authority, and
he did.
And he had sort of the inside track as to what was happening. That's right,
he did. And it was thanks to that, he was actually in the office, in the administrative office, he knew what was going on. Because in August 1941, or the end of July 1941, the amnesty came. And all these camps would have been told about it, but they tried to keep it a secret. But Dad knew because he was in the office. And they were the only two, because they wouldn't let any of the others out. He actually forged some papers as well so that they could leave, and they did. And there was just him and Mum. And he knew he had to leave because he had to tell. General Anders was forming the Polish army by that time, and he had to tell who was, because they needed to know where all these Polish pockets of people were. So he and Mum went to be able to inform that there are still loads and loads of Polish people in Georgia.
So where did he go to? Where did they went together? They
did, and we've got a little diary actually of their journey, which is very difficult to translate because of the Polish writing. You know how they wrote, but they travelled from to Batumi, and then from Batumi they were going to Tbilisi, which is the capital of Georgia. On the way, they stopped at Tbilisi, and Mum saw these beautiful peaches on the station, and she wanted one of these peaches. So Dad got off to get her some peaches, and whilst he was buying these peaches, the train moved off. He'd got all the papers, so he must have shouted to her through the window, "Get off at the next station." And the next station was it would have been Baku. Because Rostov was it was Baku. Baku was the next station, which is going to Azerbaijan. But that was the next one, and he said, "Get off at the next station." So she got off at the next station and huddled in the station, waiting for him. And there were no other trains. That was the only train going that day. But Dad being Dad, there was a coal wagons going by trundling, so he just jumped on one of those, because the little diary says he arrived at Baku and jumped off looking like the devil incarnate.
So that's reunited.
Yes, and by this time it's very, very late at night. They didn't allow anybody to be in the station, so they turfed Mum out. She was huddled somewhere outside the station. He couldn't find her, so he went off to a hotel and had a good night's sleep. And next day went to the station and found Mum dishevelled, poor thing. So he took her back to the hotel so she could clean up and have a bit of a rest. And then they actually went to the police station, the local police station, and he showed them the papers that he'd got. And they were able to then go on to the next train, which was this train was going to Moscow, because that's where they were heading for, and it stopped in Rostov, and they got out at Rostov. Again, they had to wait until they got proper permission to go, because everywhere you went then you had to have permission. And I think they were about a week there, a week to 2 weeks. And the day they left to go on to Moscow, the Germans bombed Rostov, and that was it. No more trains after that.
So I understand he meet Anders?
Yes, oh yes.
Tell me about that.
I mean, we don't know an awful lot, but because he was one of the first to arrive. I mean, they must have arrived in Moscow around the sort of 3rd week in August, and so there wouldn't have been many officers still coming out of all these various camps. So he was one of the first ones, and he was already a lieutenant. Was it a lieutenant? And he became the quartermaster then. So he was a lieutenant quartermaster. So he was then in charge of finding out and setting up. So he got a team of people around him to set up, because they went to Buzuk first, and then Totskoy, and a few other camps around there to set up ready for all these people who were going to come. So yes, he did know Anders quite well.
So that was near the Kazakhstan border then?
Yeah.
And what were there were men coming from everywhere, I would imagine.
Yes,
and what sort of condition were they in?
They were in terrible state. Many of these from Siberia, I mean, when you see a map...
Nearly starving some of them.
Well, without shoes, without clothing, starving, and with families, because they weren't just the men on their own, they had families as well. And so they were all heading, and the Russians were making it really difficult for them to get to Moscow to be able to form this Polish army in Russia. Yeah. It was a difficult situation. And then when they did get to, eventually it must have been in the, I would say, it would have been about, I don't know, going on for winter in 1941, when they finally got to these camps where they were making the camps. And all these men were then being directed, and the families. Typhoid broke out. And Mum actually was a nurse, and she got typhoid as well in the end. And it was awful. It was terrible. They had no medication, nothing.
So was that then the formation of the Second Army, the Second Army Corps?
Well,
I think it might have been.
I think it was, but
because it was then they were then evacuated.
That's right.
To Iran.
Yes.
Or Persia.
That's right. I mean,
tell us about that.
It was the Second Army, but there was also. I mean, I don't know an awful lot about our army, because I know that Dad was part of the 6th platoon, the 6th weaponry platoon or something like that, heavy platoon, something like that, because he was motorised, the 6th motorised platoon, because every photograph you see is Dad either on a motorbike or in a car, because he's all over the place. But then so there were platoons within this corps, I suppose, the 2nd Division, wasn't it, something like that.
Yes. And they ended up in Tehran.
So the first, the first consignment, so to speak, of men left in about March 1942, and that's when Mum and Dad would have gone to Iran in 1942. They were all going. It was all going from a place called Krasnovodsk. From there, they sailed to the port, and I don't know where it is now, but the port was called Pahlavi, because if you remember the what's his name, the Persian ruler there, the Shah was a Pahlavi. His name was Pahlavi.
And you were born there then at that time, and your siblings. You have 2 siblings.
Yeah,
I think.
mean, so that was so they arrived in March 1942. Not all the army then went to Iran. From there, some of them went to Palestine, and from Palestine they went to Italy, didn't they?
Yeah.
I think Dad went to Tehran because they then went to Africa. He was part of the Africa Corps afterwards, the Polish division in Africa.
And you and your siblings, tell me about your siblings.
I was born in Tehran in 1942, November 1942. But Mish, my next sister, and Chris, they were born in Africa.
Ah.
By that time, we were in Africa.
So, how long were they in Iran then? And then tell us about going to Africa.
I think in Iran, I was born in November 1942. Mish was born. You were born in August 1944. So between 1942 and 1944, Dad would have been transferred to Africa. And then Chrissy, the youngest one, was born in 1946.
Transferred to Southern Rhodesia, I believe it was.
Yes, it was Southern Rhodesia at the time.
And what followed from there? And how did they then come to Britain? And when did they come to Britain?
So Dad was... We lived, first of all, in a place called Marandellas. And then we moved to a place called Gatuma. And then Dad, we don't really know what happened, but he became seriously ill. And he was not discharged, but he was on sick leave from about 1943-44, where we've got sort of little notes where he'd been to several hospitals, so we don't know what was the matter with him. And then in 1948, we think, he was brought over to England. We stayed on, all because they had to disband the Polish army, and it was disbanded in England in 1948. And they brought the families over about 1949, so we followed in 1949, and we ended up in the Midlands.
And were you in a resettlement camp or not?
We weren't, no. Dad managed to find lodgings so that we didn't have to be in a settlement camp.
And then you followed shortly afterwards?
Yeah, and we sailed from Africa about 1949, and I think we arrived, I think it was April time, because it was Easter time when we arrived, and it was the first time I'd ever seen snow. We opened the door and I walked out and said, "What on earth is this?" And my mum said, "That's snow."
So he set up home with you and the family.
Yeah.
And what did he do after the war?
Oh dear,
and your mother, what
well,
did
he remained, and he worked in Goodyear's for a while, and then he worked somewhere else, and he was an accountant, a bookkeeper as well. You know, he continued doing that.
And your mother?
And Mum, well, I don't think she really worked anywhere. Did she?
Yeah.
Oh, she did. That's right. Yes, she worked in a shop, in a Polish shop, and then they started a restaurant together.
Ah, and when did they die?
Dad died in 1962 and Mum died in 2007.
And
2005, I beg your pardon.
And
yes.
Did he ever become, did they both become naturalised British?
Yeah,
they did.
Yeah, they did, yes.
That really is a truly remarkable story, isn't it? Full of coincidences and adventure and danger.
Well, I think particularly if I think back about the stories that Mum had in Georgia, the type of stories she had, things that went for her, like
yes.
You've got to finish off.
Well, you were just going to say.
Sorry, I'm looking at everybody. That the time when she had scurvy, the doctor said to her that she would have to have as many vegetables and what have you. So her friend, they worked on a melon field, and her friend, and all these melons were dated and marked and numbered, and she still managed to get melons for Mum.
Well, I think we'll finish on the melons.
Yeah, finish on the
So,
melons. Yeah.
Rysia and Misha, who is also with us this afternoon, I'd like to thank you very much indeed for participating on our archive project.
Yeah.
We're working in collaboration with the Norfolk Record Office, and this story will be part of a Polish collection.
Yes.
And to record the history of Poles and their relatives who've lived in Norfolk. So thank you very much indeed.
You're welcome.